During development, a game can end up changing in a way where it barely has any resemblance to how it started. Both Final Fantasies 15 and Type 0 were initially revealed as spin-offs to 13, before later being sold as standalone releases that at most only share similar narrative themes and mythology. The kid-friendly N64 platformer Conker's Quest eventually transformed into the M-rated Conker's Bad Fur Day, and Team Fortress 2 went from a fairly realistic military game with RTS elements to being about two teams of borderline psychotic mercenaries with an art style inspired by early to mid 20th century commercials. However, I think the strongest way a game can change is when something that was originally supposed to be a continuation of an already existing franchise ends up morphing into a completely new series. Basically the video game equivalent of E.T. being the end product of a scrapped Close Encounters of the Third Kind sequel. It's a rare occurrence for sure, and how much resemblance it has with the original series is a case-by-case basis, but it has happened quite a few times. So join me as we take a look at some games that were originally supposed to be sequels. Releasing on Halloween in 2002, BloodRayne is an action hack-and-slash for the PS2, original Xbox, and GameCube made by developer Terminal Reality, which follows the Dampier Rain performing various missions for the Brimstone Society, a secret group that protects humanity from supernatural forces, all in exchange for information on where her vampiric father is. Her missions primarily revolving around looking into a recent rise in demonic entities seemingly caused by the Nazis. In overall getting pretty favorable reviews, with it at least doing well enough to get a sequel in 2004, a 2D spin-off in 2011, as well as multiple comics and technically four, live-action movies made by the filmmaking genius that is Uwe Boll. The origins of this game are actually fairly similar to another one I considered talking about for this video, that being the original Devil May Cry, as both are PS2 era action titles that started life as sequels to survival horror games, with DMC originally being a potential concept for Resident Evil 4. Meanwhile, BloodRayne was originally going to be a follow-up to the 1999 PC game Nocturne, which sees you play as a member of a secret branch of the American government created by Theodore Roosevelt to battle monsters. The story consisting of 4 cases which sees the player character, only referred to as the Stranger, battling zombies, werewolves, and vampires. Now, as for why it became an original game after entering development as Nocturne 2, it was the end result of a domino effect that started with the game being turned down by the original's publisher, Gathering of Developers, who did so due to them not really having the cash to fund it, with this also being just a few years before they would eventually shut down and get absorbed by Take-Two Interactive. This left Terminal Reality in an odd position where they wanted to do a Nocturne sequel, but at the same time weren't sure if they could trust the new publisher with the IP. So to play things safe, Nocturne 2 shifted from a full-blown sequel to instead being a game that carried its spirit, with stuff like the main protagonist Rain being heavily inspired by Nocturne's Svetlana Lupeska, a Dampier who was sent to assist the Stranger during the first case at a German castle, with early beta artwork being so close it suggests that Svetlana was going to be the main protagonist originally, along with said German castle which served as the setting for Nocturne's first act, also doubling as the setting for several of BloodRayne's levels, effectively making it an original story that could feasibly still be set in the same universe. Unfortunately, Nocturne has been mostly forgotten, its only other notable appearances being how the investigation unit the main character works for also show up in a Blair Witch game made by the same developers, with BloodRayne going completely dormant throughout most of the 2010s, only making a somewhat recent comeback after all 3 games saw modern re-releases in 2020 on PC and 2021 on consoles. So maybe consider checking those out so that BloodRayne can at least have a better lasting legacy than Uwe Boll casting himself as Hitler. Next up, we have probably one of the most infamous games of all time with Ninjabread Man, a 3D platformer that initially released in 2005 exclusively in Europe for the PS2 and PC, though it wouldn't become widely known until 2007, when it was re-released on the Wii across all regions. It quickly garnering its reputation as the poster boy of shovelware, crappy, low-budget games that tend to swamp platforms with little to no quality control, like the PS2, Steam, and in this case, the Wii. The game not only just being really bad, but also shockingly thin on content, consisting of just 4 levels, one of which is the tutorial, which made things kind of surprising when people discovered that this game was originally supposed to be a revival for the classic Amiga platform series Zool, the gremlin ninja from another dimension whose adventure was brought to you by Chupa Chups. Whilst we don't have the full details of what exactly went down, the popular retelling of the story is that Zoo Digital Publishing, the company who owned the rights to Zool, licensed out the IP to developer Data Design Interactive to make what would have been Zool 3, but upon seeing how awful the game was going to be, they decided to pull the license. But instead of letting their work go to waste, DDI decided to just replace the main character with a biscuit, and then released the scrapped Zool 3 as what we now know as Ninjabread Man, with them then later re-releasing the game multiple times by reskinning it with different themes, giving the end results of Anubis II, Mythmaker's Trixie and Toyland, and Rock'n'Roll Adventures, along with a lesser-known Casper game for the PS2 that only released in Europe. Now, if you're wondering how exactly we found out this was supposed to be a Zool game, in addition to the original opening cutscene eventually leaking online, which is actually a fairly faithful retelling of a comic included in the instruction book for the Super Nintendo port of Zool, within the files of both Ninjabread Man and Anubis II, there's a text file which makes direct mention of the planned levels: Sweet World, Toy World, Music World, Egypt World, and the creatively named World, suggesting that a 5th level was scrapped fairly early on. Not only are all 4 of the named level themes from the first Zool, with all but Egypt World being what the respective stages were actually called, but this also tells us DDI was so lazy, they didn't even come up with the concepts for their half-assed reskins. They just worked backwards from level themes they already made assets for as part of their failed Zool 3 pitch, and then sold them as 4 separate games. I genuinely cannot believe that this level of creative bankruptcy was even possible, but hey, I guess it's moves like that which helped DDI become one of the biggest third-party developers on the Wii, until their name became Game Dev Poison and they shut down in 2012. I'll end this section on a potentially horrifying thought. You reckon by the 2030s there'll be a revival of these games like how Bubsy came back in the late 2010s, despite the fact that most people agree his games are terrible? Imagine living to see Ninjabread Man rebaked. For probably the most obvious case of this happening, we have Bravely Default, the 2012 3DS RPG by Square Enix and Silicon Studio, which follows a party of 4 heroes traveling to reclaim the 4 crystals which keep their homeworld of Luxembourg in balance from the darkness. Now, if a Square Enix RPG about a group of heroes working together to recover 4 crystals that represent various elements which in turn are deeply tied to the lore of their world sounds suspiciously familiar, that's because that's also basically a description of the first Final Fantasy, as well as a handful of other FF games. So yeah, I don't think you'll be too shocked to hear that Bravely Default started life as a Final Fantasy game, specifically as a sequel or follow-up to the 2009 DS spin-off, The 4 Heroes of Light, which was made by Matrix Software and intentionally recreated the gameplay feel of the NES entries with some extra bells and whistles, most notably the option for 4-player co-op. Despite how much of early Final Fantasy's DNA ended up in the game, Tomoya Asona, who served as producer for both 4 Heroes and Bravely Default, explained in interviews that despite the fact that the title could have very easily been an FF game, he decided fairly early on that he wanted it to be an original IP that could stand out from both it and Dragon Quest, specifically bringing up the game's use of 3DS features like Street Pass and augmented reality as ways of making it unique, with the elements that were kept being done so in order to ease in people that were already familiar with those kinds of games. Whilst it's debatable if this strategy worked for the first entry, especially given how frequent the comparisons to Final Fantasy were amongst both general audiences and the press, since then it has done well enough to get 2 sequels, one direct and one set in another world, along with a HD remaster of the first game as a Switch 2 launch title, so I'd say he got his way in the end. Speaking of Square RPGs though, yes, we'll be sticking around with Square for our final game of the day with 1998's Xenogears, the cult classic PS1 RPG that would eventually lead to the creation of Monolith Soft, as well as both the Xenosaga and Xenoblade series, with all 3 owing their creation to married couple Tetsuya Takahashi and Kaori Tanaka, the pair having done some design work across some of Square's most beloved games on the Super Nintendo, such as Final Fantasies 4 through 6 and Romancing Saga 1 and 3. So based on that background, I don't think you'd be too shocked to hear that what is now considered the first Xenoverse game was originally pitched as a concept for Final Fantasy VII, which was greenlit by Superior, albeit not as a Final Fantasy game, owing to them feeling that what they wanted to make was too dark and complicated for a fantasy. Now, that part of the story is relatively common knowledge, at least amongst Xenoverse fans. However, the part that is less discussed is how when the development team was first being formed for the game, internally it still wasn't being viewed as an original IP, but instead as a potential sequel to Chrono Trigger, which Takahashi had also worked on as graphic director, though this apparently shifted into being the game that would finally be known as Xenogears fairly quickly, owing to Takahashi's desire to incorporate more sci-fi elements, along with a lot of the plot and thematic elements still not really meshing well with Chrono Trigger, owing to how different it was when compared to most of Square's output to that point, something that proved to be difficult even after the game had effectively crossed the finish line when the English translators faced issues trying to properly convey what the story was going for, owing to its heavy usage of scientific concepts, various philosophies, and religious references. Pretty wild to think that we were pretty close to being in the timeline where the ground zero for what is currently one of Nintendo's most beloved development studios was either Final Fantasy VII or Chrono Trigger 2. Guess the end moral of all of this is that not everything needs to be a continuation, and that as long as it's given enough room to breathe, something that could make a great sequel could prove to be an even better beginning for something new. Or you could just do what Hellraiser did and just randomly insert characters into things that originally had nothing to do with them and call it a sequel. Whatever works, I guess.